the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We've been following the protests in France for quite some time now. I should identify which protests. Of course, we had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests a while back, and in recent months, we've seen an upsurge in activity around pension cuts, so-called pension reform, to use that Orwellian term for a cut. And joining us, keeping us posted on that, has been journalist Cole Stangler. Cole is an author and reporter based in France. He's been covering this story from the very start. There have been some developments that have made front page news even here in the United States. So without any further ado, Cole Stangler, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's always great to talk to you. But for the labor movement and the protesters, and some might argue the working people of France, the news this past week has not been all that great, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it depends on how you're looking at it, but certainly, yes. At least the beginning of the week was not great. So just to give a quick recap here, we had this, historically large movement over pension reform, and then finally we had the government, because of this mass protest movement, decided, because they wanted to pass this bill initially through the traditional legislative process, but because they did not have the votes going down to the wire, they decided to deploy what's known as Article 49.3, which is a constitutional maneuver here that allows the government to approve certain pieces of legislation without a vote in Parliament, without a vote in the National Assembly. So the government activated that measure to approve the bill. And then what we saw earlier this week on Monday was the only attempt, really the only way that Parliament can override that triggering of that Article 49.3 is to have a motion of no confidence, a successful motion of no confidence against the government, which both blocks the legislation in question and then forces the cabinet to tender its resignation. So a sort of high political drama in Parliament earlier this week. On Monday, we had that vote in the National Assembly, which ended up being a lot closer than a lot of people anticipated. Ultimately, the government of Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, won by 9 votes, survived the motion of no confidence by 9 votes, but that was a lot tighter than a lot of people thought. So that means, in effect, the government has survived this sort of significant challenge to its authority, and then the bill, in theory, is slated to take effect now.
Now, let me just fill in a couple things for folks who might not fully follow or may not have, been keeping up on this call. One is that, so measure 49.3 or whatever it's called is kind of an executive beast mode option, right? That I think it's a holdover from Charles de Gaulle or something when the French Republic was really unstable. It's something like that, right? It's basically something that says, even though Parliament has refused to pass this law, I'm going to enact it anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily a holdover from de Gaulle. It's very much a part of the Gaullist framing of the French Fifth Republic, which was designed precisely to make for effective governance, and what the framers at the time wanted to surmount the sort of instability of the Fourth Republic, where you had this kind of mess in Parliament all the time. And the idea was to have a strong executive that, in times of crisis, and just as a matter of general principle, would have the ability to push forward legislation. And so
I guess my point in that sense, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to nail everything down for people. My point in that is that, to me anyway, it feels like kind of an archaic thing based on the politics of 60 years ago, or whenever, rather than now. And then for the rest of the context for all of this, Cole, as you and I have been discussing, and as you've been reporting, there have been months and months of mass protests against this idea of what is called it's basically a pension cut, however you describe it, but this raising of the pension age, other functions is politically unpopular. It couldn't, my understanding, couldn't get passed through parliament. So he used this, this beast mode option, this relic from another time to push it through. And when you say that the cabinet, the government almost had to tender its resignation, the prime minister, that's because there's a president of France and there's a prime minister, and the prime minister is in his party, right? And so he nearly saw a government collapse. He would have lost his job anyway, Macron, right? If this had happened, or what would have happened?
What would have happened is that the prime minister would have resigned. You would have had to have new elections, almost certainly new.
Elizabeth Byrne or whomever.
Yeah. So that's the prime minister and the cabinet, and that did not happen. So I'm trying to think about where to go back to on what you were saying here, because I think what you mentioned is what began as this sort of movement over pension reform is now transformed into I think a full-fledged political crisis. And I think you're right to interrogate the political institutions of France, because right now, there's a conversation about how adequate they are, how appropriate they are for the political moment that we're living in today in France. I mean, how is it possible, like you said, that we have a pension bill that is broadly unpopular? So from the start, 7 in 10 French people oppose the reform. Historically large protest movement. They can't get it through parliament, and yet the president is able to deploy this measure. So it has triggered a bigger conversation about France's political institutions. And I want to, before maybe we get into that, just want to stress that the movement, this battle, quote unquote, isn't over yet. There's a couple of things that could still happen that certainly what protesters are hoping for. A couple of things that could force the government still to lose this battle. So one is the protests continue. That's one option. And that's what we've been seeing today. So today we had an uptick in strikes and protests, again called for by the United Union Coalition that is stuck together precisely because of the government using this executive authority that's angered a lot of people. So protests look like they're up again today. There's actually a precedent for the French government not enacting laws that have already been approved by the National Assembly in the face of mass protests. You have to go back to 2006. There was protests over youth employment contract. The Assembly passed the bill. Protests continued, and eventually Jacques Chirac, who you might say had perhaps a little bit more wisdom as a head of state than Macron, said perhaps this is not the right time to move forward with this bill. And so ultimately, it was never implemented, and the National Assembly went back and then passed another law saying that essentially annulling that bill. So that's one option. The protests continue, and this bill gets scrapped. Anyways, it doesn't seem terribly likely, because right now Macron gave a speech yesterday, his first big address on this topic, really since the movement began, and he did not seem very apologetic. And the other option, I'll just mention it very quickly, Richard, is the French Constitutional Council, which is the rough equivalent of the Supreme Court, could invalidate either all or perhaps parts of the text. The argument there, very quickly, is that the government has misused a lot of these executive orders and authorities that it does have in order to get this bill across the finish line. Article 49.3 is very much legal. It's part of the French Constitution, but there's perhaps an argument to be made that it was misused in this particular case. So those are the two options. Protests continue and the government backs down, maybe seems unlikely. And the other one is really the Constitutional Council stepping in, not stepping in, but actually invalidating potentially part of this reform.
And is that because there's some sort of argument or some sort of a conditionality in Article 49.3 that says if there is XYZ and possibility of resolving an issue, and so the argument could be made those conditions weren't met, and therefore it's something like that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. There's without going too much into French constitutional law, there's the government used a number of different articles in order to cut off debate essentially in parliament. And so if you pass laws, you're supposed to, in theory, have a vigorous parliamentary debate. And so there's an argument that perhaps, speeding up the process did not allow for sufficient parliamentary debate, not just Article 49.3, some other mechanisms that I won't even get into. That's one thing. And then And then, yes, Article 49.3 you can use for certain pieces of legislation, not all types of legislation. The government here specifically put pension reform as part of a budgetary package. And the argument is that that a reform of this magnitude, shouldn't have been just attached to this other bill to therefore allow them to use the specific article. There's an argument to be made that it wasn't meant for standalone reforms of this magnitude. The government shouldn't have just, attached it to this other budgetary bill. So
zooming out to the big picture, Cole, back out to the big picture. I was just curious because, I think I had sort of come away until we began to talk with the impression that, well, the good guys lost, or I would consider the good guys. It's probably over. I knew there was an appeal process taking place, but, I'm so used to the American system where once it gets to, for example, the Supreme Court, you're doomed. But whether or not that's the case, it sounds to me that the two things that are keeping this alive, not just the technical or constitutional issues that might need to be adjudicated, but the fact that perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, the power of the political blowback maybe hasn't diminished as much. People haven't just said, "Oh, well, we lost." They haven't gone home, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, there was Macron gave his first televised interview on this topic. First real significant remarks on this pension battle since the protest movement began. And I think it's sort of a small detail, but I think if you're here in France, I think it's important to stress is that, this makes me think a lot of the Yellow Vest movement, just a sort of sense of aloofness from the president, the fact that you have this very disruptive movement that everyone knows about, and the president, can't be bothered to speak about it, and he's waiting for the right moment to finally address the nation as the sort of almost monarch like figure. And so he finally gave this long anticipated address, which was in the form of a TV interview, and it was very classic Macron in the sense that people perceived it as, a lot of the critics have perceived it as being condescending, just aloof. He said that he's not doing this out of pleasure, but because it's necessary. He even compared, and I think this provoked a lot of people, he compared the demonstrators to the January 6th rioters in the U.S. And then to the rioters in Brazil as well, in Brasilia. He's made remarks about reported in the press, this time not in that official interview on Wednesday, but talking about how the crowd, the quote crowd, is not legitimate, but the elected representatives of the nation are legitimate. So you have these little, I think, provocations from Macron that I think upset a lot of people. And if you look at polls, they show that immediate reaction to his comments yesterday were not very positive. People were not convinced. And then polls show people want the protest movement to go on. So I think there's a lot of anger that we're now at the point, again, like the Yellow Vest, that we have an anger that goes beyond just a specific particular policy question, in this case pensions, but takes on larger dimensions. I don't know if it means that the movement is going to win. It might not. In all likelihood, the government seems pretty set on not giving ground. But a lot of this does remind me of those early days of the Yellow Vest. Just that the sheer the opposition, the sense of just disconnect from the president, and a sense that people, and I think the last point I'll make is, without romanticizing it, a sort of popular mandate for disruptive action and disruptive protest. It's pretty remarkable today that you have, after a law that's been passed, 2 out of 3 people in France saying, yeah, we think there should be continued disruptions and strikes. I think that sort of is emblematic of the anger against the president.
Yeah, and I wonder if that anger is being translated into anger against the system that allows this to happen, or if it's, in other words, if there's disaffection with the political process, or is it all mostly anger, you think, focused on Macron himself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. A lot of the workers that have been sort of leading the strike movement are digging in. I don't want to. It's not necessarily everywhere across the country, but here where I am in Marseille, just north of here, about an hour northwest, is this big industrial zone where you have a few refineries. There's the main port of Marseille, which is the largest in France. You have big recycling facility, the last steelworks. So anyways, sort of this big, industrial zone. And a lot of the workers there have continued to lead strikes. I was there earlier this week, and people are committed to continuing to protest. I think there's also been back to work orders that have been issued to workers at one of the fuel depots, and that's provoked a lot of anger. So, I don't know how we're talking about a very specific subset of the workforce, but I think that they want to continue, and they have an outsized impact too. When you're talking about refineries, you can very quickly have shortages of fuel. We have fuel shortages where I'm speaking to you from right now in our department in the south of France because of the strikes at refineries. So I think
which is significant. I'm sorry to interrupt again, but which is significant, of course, because when strike actions start affecting the day-to-day functioning of society, that's when they start to really have the potential to change a political outcome, right? Because, I mean, there's a point at which people are going to say it's not worth the price we're paying for the normal functioning of society. You posted some video, Cole, of strikers, it looked like outside an oil refinery, who were, confronting police, and there was back and forth, and I couldn't quite tell what it was, but something was burning in the background, and I know there have been fires in that part of around France, I guess, actually. So there's been a little bit of, I guess you'd say, violence and disruption as well. Is that, first of all, am I characterizing that right? And secondly, is that continuing?
Yeah, I mean, that's continuing here where I am. That's sort of there's a blockade set up in front of a fuel depot where workers have had back to work orders. And so the union that represents them has called workers from other sectors to go on the scene and to protest what they consider to be an attack on their ability to strike. And actually, people will be gathering there later this afternoon again, and then tomorrow. And so it's sort of turned into this kind of symbolic, but not just symbolic, space here for protests in the south of France. And yeah, the scenes I saw were pretty remarkable just a few days ago. But I think maybe to get back to something else you were alluding to, Richard, which is this question of sort of what's the fallout from this. And I think really the point about France's political institutions, I think, is interesting. I mean, there's been, is this maybe going to renew calls to change the Fifth Republic, to get to have some people have been calling for a Sixth Republic on the left. That's something that France Insoumise has talked about a lot. I was speaking with someone who doesn't go that far, but Patrick Vey, who's a political scientist and historian, who said that maybe what France needs to do. This is a very simple, almost sort of cosmetic reform, but I think in a lot of ways is quite reasonable. Perhaps we should have we should redetach the presidential elections from the legislative elections. Until 2002, these elections were not taking place at the same time. And so you had the possibility for what was called, or you had increased possibility for what was called cohabitation, meaning having a president and a prime minister from a different party. These elections, the legislative elections, again, before 2002, also functioned as a kind of de facto midterm election. If you didn't like what the president was doing, well, you could come out a couple years later and vote to give another party a majority in parliament and then force them to share power. Now, France is in the situation where just less than a year after the president has been reelected with a razor-thin majority that's not an absolute majority in parliament, we have now just 4 years of not really being able to do anything. The president want to have new elections. And so Um, there's been calls to maybe instead of having maybe we don't have to go so far as to have a sixth republic, but maybe you can reinforce the role of parliament in the fifth republic, which is arguably how, maybe there is a parliament should have stronger authority in the way than it's being practiced today. I think this whole conflict raises questions about, again, the legitimacy of not just Macron, but the way he's carrying out his executive power. Because how are we again, to ask the question I asked at the beginning, how are we in a situation where you have an extremely unpopular law, historically large protests, a parliament that's unable to pass a bill, and yet the president is still able to approve this law? And frankly, what is it going to mean for the rest of his presidency too? He may have, let's say, even he does win this victory on the specific question of pensions. He's burned a lot of bridges, alienated a lot of negotiating partners, potential allies. How is he going to achieve his agenda, for the next 4 years?
And all of which, among other things, raises the question, which I think a lot of people are asking, and it ultimately ties to some questions here in the U.S. too, but why would Macron, a president of France, as you say, elected razor thin a margin, not a majority in parliament and so on, why would he risk so much on this one issue? Why is this issue so important that he's willing to, pay such a terrible political price and cause such damage to public morale, public trust in government? He seems real determined to do this. And I'm just wondering, is it him personally? Is it the ideology he represents? Is it his backers and that they've insisted he do this? What do you think is behind this action?
Yeah, I think that's a question a lot of people are wondering. I think I remember even speaking with you. Maybe it was in last fall, maybe after his election, where we knew that this pension reform was coming, and I just couldn't for the life of me understand why, even from that perspective, from the Macronist perspective, why would you risk all this political capital on something like this? But yeah, it's a good question. From what I understand from speaking to people is, there's a sense that he's very disconnected from what the population thinks. I was just speaking with the head of the CFDT union, which is a moderate union, the biggest union confederation in France. And that union, was ready to compromise with Macron. They were ready to make concessions and have a discussion about pension reform with Macron. That's how they see them. That's how they view themselves as a union. And they got to the negotiating table, and the government just didn't want to listen to them. They were unwilling to budge on this question of hiking the retirement age. The way that the president of the union put it to me was that this was a political decision that was made. It's non-negotiable, the hiking the retirement age, and now we'll go through the motions and talk, but this is essentially set in stone. And so then the question is, well, why did you decide to hike? Why is this hiking the retirement age, non-negotiable? I think some of the reasons that people have floated here, and I think maybe the most compelling argument, which is not the argument that this is designed to save the pension system. I think that is fairly dubious. I think experts have shown that the pension system is not on the brink of collapse. But I think one of the more compelling arguments is that the government has spent a lot of money that they did not anticipate spending in the COVID crisis. The government wants to show to the European Union that they're keeping their budget in order. And so, if you want to generate savings to carry out tax cuts, to carry out your agenda, this is an excellent place to find money, for lack of a better word. France spends a high amount of its budget, a high amount of its GDP on maintaining the pension system. And so a measure like this does unlock a significant amount of savings. And so I think there's a case to be made that this is a measure that it's already been in terms of their budgeting, that this is how they're going to generate savings to finance the rest of their agenda. And so if they've made that decision, it's sort of non-negotiable. But again, is that really how democracy should work? If that's the case, if that is indeed the main reason, which again is a hypothesis, but I think it's a fairly compelling one. If that is true, it's not doesn't reflect very well on French democracy and the way that parties should be carrying out their agenda. Yeah.
And if I wanted to be really provocative, I could say that, trying to impress the Germans with your discipline doesn't have a distinguished history in France. But I won't be that provocative when it comes to, impressing the European Union or whatever. But I will say this, that I think there's a lot of misconception in the United States and elsewhere about the French pension system. But correct me if I'm wrong. My sense is it's lavish. You can retire so young. And, I've seen charts that compare it to, in Germany, retirement age is 64. What's wrong with bringing it in line with Germany? But I started doing a little digging, and I think what I saw was, I don't have my notes in front of me, but that the average pension, it varies a lot by the sector you worked in and the union you were in and so on, but that the average pension is about 1,500 euros, I think, it doesn't strike me as particularly exorbitant, let's say. And that, as you pointed out the last time you came on the show, that you can only retire at 62 if you've been working since you're 20, right? So, I think the fact is that while I'm sure that they do spend a large amount of their GDP on pensions and so on, that it's not because this is a wildly generous system. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think, when I've been writing about it to compare to the US, I use the word relatively generous. So the word relative is doing a lot of work, because when you're comparing France to the US. When you speak with people here that are, on the brink of retirement, they're not expecting, lavish retirement. I was just speaking with someone who works at who's a security guard essentially at a incinerator, garbage incinerator in Fos-sur-Mer, this industrial zone I was talking about. She's 52 years old, so coming close to on retirement. She works just above minimum wage, and she'll be receiving, a pretty modest pension. These are not, lavish pensions. And frankly, I'll say, I think any of these, it does bother me when I hear, fellow journalists and editorialists talking about these quote unquote lavish, French pensions. I think these people should go and honestly, scrub toilets, when they're, 62 years old, honestly. And then maybe they'll have a different perspective when they're earning minimum wage, on a construction site, or up on, scaffolding, working as a mechanic. Because I think if they talk to some of these people and frequenting some of these people, then they would maybe have a different perspective. The problem is, as in the media, we have a lot of people that are disconnected, that don't know what ordinary people are going through. So, the fact is, the majority of French people are still against the reform. Yeah.
And so what should we be looking for next? I guess the Constitutional Council decision could be a huge factor. Do we know when that's expected?
I think that should be in a few weeks. They're expected to take it up, so we don't know exactly when. It's been transferred to them, but I think that'll be a few weeks. And then in the meantime, we had a big protest today. There's the sort of eternal game of trying to figure out how were the numbers, were they a little bit higher or lower than the last ones. It looks like this was pretty big, so we'll continue to have these big days of mobilization. And then the other thing to look for is intermittent strikes and disruptions. But again, I think it feels similar to those that the early stages of the Yellow Vest, where you had this sort of somewhat disruptive, kind of unpredictable aspect. But things could peter out. They may not. It's hard to say.
And before you go, what ended the Yellow Vest movement? Was it COVID? It was sweeping France for so long and then it dissipated? I'm just curious. I've never asked you that.
Well, the movement actually was it peaked at the very beginning in terms of the sheer numbers of protesters. You had concessions that were announced by the government. The biggest one being a small hike in the essentially an effective hike in the minimum wage, not in the overall number, but a program on top of it. And you had a number of measures that were handed out. They scrapped the fuel tax hike that was the initial source of frustration, and then eventually the movement slowly kind of petered out. But you still have people that have the yellow vests on today when they're at demonstrations, and a lot of these people are still active.
So they made concessions to the yellow vests and no concessions whatsoever so far, anyway, to the people behind this movement. Interesting. Okay, well, I know you'll keep following it. Cole, again, my guest has been Cole Stangler, author and journalist. Thanks for all your great work in covering this, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Richard.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.